In 2010, the Irish government identified 2,846 unfinished housing developments scattered across the country, empty shells of what the Celtic Tiger economy had promised would be thriving new neighbourhoods. Round that number and you get close enough to 3,000 that the figure has stuck permanently in the popular imagination as Ireland's 3,000 ghost estates. It is not an exact number, but it is close enough to the official count to be a fair and useful shorthand for one of the strangest chapters in modern Irish economic history. Here is what that number actually represented on the ground, because it is worth being specific rather than treating it as an abstraction. A ghost estate, in the precise definition used by that 2010 government survey, was any housing development where construction had visibly stalled, where roads, footpaths and street lighting sat unfinished, where a meaningful proportion of the planned housing units remained either partially built or entirely unbuilt, and where the developer behind the project had, in the vast majority of cases, gone into insolvency before completing what they had started. These were not simply slow-selling housing estates waiting for buyers. Many of them were physically incomplete, with skeletal concrete frames standing where finished homes were supposed to be, overgrown with weeds within a single season of construction stopping. So let me walk through exactly how the country ended up with nearly 3,000 of these, because understanding the cause is essential to understanding how thoroughly the problem was eventually solved. Throughout the early 2000s, Ireland experienced a period of sustained, rapid economic growth that became known internationally as the Celtic Tiger, driven by foreign direct investment, a young and growing workforce, and critically for this specific story, an extraordinarily loose credit environment that allowed banks to lend against property development on a scale that had never previously existed in the Irish market. Planning permissions for new housing developments were granted at a pace that far outstripped any realistic assessment of actual housing demand in many of the areas where they were approved, particularly in smaller towns and rural areas far from Dublin's genuine employment growth, where speculative developers built housing estates on the assumption that continued population growth and continued credit availability would eventually fill them with buyers. That assumption held for a remarkably short period of time. The global financial crisis, beginning in 2007 and intensifying dramatically through 2008, exposed Irish banks as catastrophically overexposed to property development lending, triggering a collapse in credit availability that stopped hundreds of construction projects mid-build, virtually overnight in some cases. Developers who had borrowed heavily against projected future sales found themselves unable to complete developments that no longer had buyers willing or able to purchase units in a collapsing property market, and unable to secure the additional financing needed to finish construction regardless. The result, surveyed formally by the government in 2010 as the scale of the crisis became undeniable, was nearly 3,000 estates scattered across every county in the country, ranging from a handful of unfinished houses in a small rural development to entire multi-phase estates standing almost completely empty. Here is the human and social cost that the raw number does not capture on its own. Families who had purchased homes in the earlier phases of these developments, before construction stalled, often found themselves living alongside abandoned, half-built houses, without the promised community amenities, playgrounds and shops that had been part of the original planning permission, and in some cases without properly finished roads or street lighting outside their own front doors. Local authorities inherited responsibility for managing sites they had never fully approved the completion of, and rural Garda stations reported a measurable rise in vandalism, illegal dumping and anti-social behaviour specifically linked to abandoned, unsecured construction sites sitting empty within otherwise occupied communities. That was the situation in 2010. Here is where the story becomes genuinely remarkable, because the recovery from that starting point has been far more thorough and far more successful than most people outside Ireland's property sector are aware of. By early 2023, the number of remaining ghost estates had fallen to just 75 nationally. From nearly 3,000 identified sites down to 75 represents a resolution rate of approximately 97%, achieved over roughly 13 years through a combination of economic recovery, targeted government intervention, and, in many cases, simple market forces reasserting themselves as the Irish economy strengthened through the 2010s. The mechanisms behind that recovery are worth understanding individually, because no single solution accounts for the entire 97% improvement. A significant portion of stalled developments were eventually completed by new developers or receivers who purchased the unfinished sites at deeply discounted prices once the original developers' insolvency proceedings concluded, finishing construction to modern standards and selling the completed units into a property market that, by the middle of the 2010s, had recovered enough demand to absorb them. Other sites were partially demolished, with unfinished or structurally compromised buildings removed entirely, and the land either redeveloped from scratch or, in a smaller number of rural cases, returned to agricultural use where housing demand in that specific location had simply never materialized and was unlikely to in future. Government intervention played a genuinely significant role as well, particularly through targeted funding schemes designed specifically to address the safety and environmental hazards that unfinished, unsecured construction sites pose to surrounding communities, even in cases where full completion of the original housing plan was neither economically viable nor genuinely needed. Local authorities received dedicated funding to secure dangerous sites, demolish unsafe structures, and in some cases complete basic infrastructure like roads and lighting, even where full housing completion was not pursued. Addressing the safety and quality of life concerns of existing residents, even in developments that would never reach their originally planned scale. Here is a specific example worth highlighting, because it illustrates the recovery pattern in concrete terms rather than pure statistics. Several previously stalled estates across the Midlands and west of Ireland, originally planned during the boom years with dozens of housing units, were eventually completed at a smaller, more realistic scale matched to actual local demand, with the unused portions of the original planning permission allowed to lapse rather than being forced through to completion regardless of whether buyers existed. These scaled-down completions represent a quieter, less dramatic form of resolution than a full boom-era completion, but they represent genuine, occupied, functioning housing rather than the concrete skeletons that stood on the same sites a decade earlier. The 75 estates still remaining as of early 2023 represent, almost by definition, the most difficult cases. Sites where the original location, scale, or specific legal and financial complications surrounding the original developer's insolvency have made resolution considerably harder than the roughly 2,770 other sites already resolved. Some of these remaining sites sit in locations where genuine housing demand still has not returned even as the wider Irish property market has recovered strongly, particularly in more remote rural areas that experience population decline independent of the ghost estate phenomenon itself. Others remain tied up in legal and financial complications specific to the individual insolvency case, where multiple creditors, incomplete land titles, or disputed ownership have slowed resolution considerably compared to more straightforward cases. Here is the broader lesson this entire episode offers, and it is worth stating plainly rather than leaving unspoken. The ghost estate crisis was a direct product of a lending and planning environment that allowed housing supply to become almost completely disconnected from genuine local demand, a lesson that has directly shaped more cautious planning and lending practices in the years since. Irish planning authorities today apply considerably more rigorous demand assessment before approving large-scale housing developments in smaller towns, and banking regulation introduced years following the crisis has significantly reduced the kind of speculative, demand-blind development lending that produced nearly 3,000 stalled estates in the first place. That does not mean Ireland's current housing situation is free of serious challenges. The country has, if anything, swung toward the opposite problem in the years since the ghost estate crisis, with housing supply now widely recognised as insufficient to meet genuine demand in Dublin and other major urban centres, driving the property price pressures explored in other investigations of Ireland's current market. But the ghost estate story itself from nearly 3,000 abandoned sites down to 75 within roughly a decade, stands as one of the more thoroughly and successfully resolved property crises of its scale anywhere in Europe. A genuinely rare example of a housing catastrophe being worked through methodically rather than simply left to decay indefinitely. Drive through rural Ireland today and, in most counties, you would need to know specifically where to look to find any remaining evidence of the crisis at all. The overwhelming majority of what were once skeletal, abandoned concrete frames are now quietly and without much fanfare. Finished homes with families living in them, gardens planted, and children playing in the same spaces that sat as vandalized construction sites little more than a decade earlier. That transformation, happening estate by estate across the country with almost no international attention, is arguably a more significant Irish infrastructure achievement than the crisis itself ever received coverage for causing. If this look at how Ireland actually solved one of its biggest housing crises was useful to you, please subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who remembers the Celtic Tiger years. Let us know in the comments if you have ever lived near or driven past one of Ireland's remaining ghost estates.